What's up YouTube? My name is Joe. I am a photographer, videographer, and as of recently photography instructor in the DC, Baltimore area, and today I want to do the very first gear review on this channel. I want to do gear reviews a little bit differently, kind of focus on more affordable and more practical gear. I don't want to feed into the echo chamber that is YouTube, Instagram nowadays. If you search street photography camera on YouTube, Google, you're going to find millions of results, but probably only a few cameras listed over and over again. Things like the Ricoh GR, Fuji X100 or X Pro series, or Leica Q or Leica M cameras. Trying to do this research, you'll probably find a lot of great options, but almost none of them are really affordable. The way that YouTube and Google are set up, they show you the most popular results, the things that are going to get the most clicks, and that's really going to be newer products. We've kind of been taught over the last decade that the newest technology is necessary in order to kind of enter into the world of photography. And, you know, I'm not gonna lie, I've bought into that. I own an XE4, I own an X Pro 2, so I'm not gonna pretend that I'm exempt from this, but it's something that I think is pretty problematic for beginning street photographers. And so today I'm going to put you onto a camera that is a cheap and capable alternative to modern day street photography cameras. And that camera is the Lumix LX5 from Panasonic. I bought this camera in November of 2020 off of eBay. I only had to spend $75, and since then I've taken some of my favorite shots with it. To quickly get into some specs that this camera has, this point and shoot was released in 2010 and has a 10 megapixel 1/1.6 inch CCD sensor. And if you have no idea what that means, I don't blame you. Here's an example of what that looks like, and as you can see, it's pretty hilariously small. This is it compared to an APS-C sensor, and yeah, it's tiny. This camera also has a 24 to 90 millimeter Vario Summicron Leica lens. The camera weighs less than 10 ounces and is similar in size to the Ricoh GR. The lens does protrude a little further, but it is still pocketable. This camera also has a built-in flash. It does not have a built-in electronic viewfinder, but you can purchase that separately, which I actually have. And believe it or not, this camera does have image stabilization internally, and it's pretty impressive from my experience. Now, when I bought this camera, I was shooting primarily with a Nikon Z6, and so I needed something that was smaller and not expensive in order to carry a camera with me every day, shoot street photography with. I knew I wanted to be practicing every day in order to get better, so the size of this camera is a huge advantage. Point and shoots tend to have kind of a touristy reputation, which is great in Washington, DC, which is a very touristy area, for being more discreet. And on top of all of that, it's still pocketable. I can even fit it into my skinny jeans pockets, which if you know me and you know my jeans, you know that's no mean feat. So definitely an advantage there. Now, I know I kind of dissed on the smaller sensor that is in this camera, but I actually do love the images that it produces. I think the low resolution kind of gives it a less digital and more film-like analog looking result, and I love that. I love the way they look. The raw files edit really well, colors are great, and as you can see from this example, I was able to bring a lot of detail back from an underexposed image. The flash is another thing that I was really impressed with. I didn't expect to be impressed with it at all. I've never used a flash. It's never been something that interested me until I owned this camera. And actually the first time I used it, I was at my brother's wedding, and the camera was great because I could fit it in my suit pocket. But at night, I kind of wanted to get some images that had a little more energy, a little more of a pop. So I tried out the flash and they really looked great. I haven't tried street photography with the flash yet. It's something I want to do, but I haven't had the courage to yet. So maybe in the future, I'll give it a shot. Another cool thing about this camera is the multi-aspect sensor. So on this camera, I can actually manually change the aspect ratio, and instead of just cropping the image, this camera's sensor actually uses different parts of the sensor 4 different aspect ratios, which means you don't lose any resolution and you get the same field of view no matter what aspect ratio you're in. Basically, it's a way of cropping your images without losing any detail, which is really cool. And I find this super useful for photos like this, where I can use the 16:9 ratio and shoot it vertically and kind of fit more information into my frame than I would otherwise have been able to. It seems a little gimmicky, but in practice, I actually think it's quite useful. Like I mentioned, I own the viewfinder for this camera, and while it's really nothing to write home about, I do find it useful for shooting in brighter, sunnier conditions where it can be hard to see the LCD screen. Now, I don't want to pretend that this camera is perfect. There are obviously some cons. It's a little outdated in some areas. One big thing is the read speed after you take photos. You only get 3 frames per second in burst mode, which is not great. And even then, you have to wait around 5 seconds for those photos to write to the SD card, which not ideal, but you kind of just have to learn to work around it. Another big con on this camera is that fixed LCD screen. I don't really care that it's not a flip out screen because that wasn't that common for older cameras, but this LCD screen is terrible. It is really bad. When I first got the camera, I thought that every photo I was taking was turning out terribly. Turns out, looking at the photos on the LCD screen, they don't look great. Once you get them onto a computer, you can kind of see the detail and the sharpness that you can get from this camera. The biggest con of this camera is absolutely the low light performance, specifically the ISO performance. I usually don't go above ISO 500. Anything above that, you'll get really ugly noise, and it can be kind of hard to work around. That being said, this camera has a maximum aperture of f2, and because of the tiny sensor, you don't really get that much of depth of field. And on top of that, the image stabilization allows you to get shutter speeds as slow as 1/15 of a second without real motion blur. So there are ways to kind of work around it, but overall, in low light, this camera is not great. You really ideally want to be using it in harsher sunlight, brighter conditions. That's just when you're going to get the best results out of it. You just have to know the weaknesses and how to work around them. I actually probably wouldn't recommend this camera. I would actually probably recommend the Lumix LX5 to anyone looking to buy a cheap street photography camera. That version has just some updated specs that I think are a big improvement. Notably, the updated LCD screen is a lot better. There's an aperture ring, which I think is super useful. I really wish that the LX5 had it. And the LX7 is only marginally more expensive. You can still buy it used for around $150. But like I said, it doesn't really matter. As long as you know the camera and you have a good eye, you'll be able to take great photos. And that's what this review is all about. It's about letting the results speak for themselves rather than the specs. So I'm just going to leave you to take a look at some of the photos I've shot with this camera, and hopefully you enjoy them. I really appreciate you listening, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.